centuries, we are now in the 15th century of Hijra, have benefited from a major element, a pillar that has sustained them in their country and has preserved and protected them. This element is Islam. That is why we have to cling to Islam. And what do we mean by that? There are those who say that they too rely on Islam, but their attachment to it can be summed up in a popular Tunisian saying: the prayer days of leaders, Fridays and holidays only. For the country's leaders, religion is mere folklore and should only be manifested during the major religious festivals, such as Eid and Ramadan. They promulgated an official fatwa excommunicating Ennahda and broadcast it on radio and television and made it known in the mosques. Is not the man who governs Tunisia like a medieval pope, who gives out tickets to heaven, helping some on their way and hindering others?
Donc, M. Ben Ali a changé la Constitution et a voulu.
So Mr. Ben Ali changed the Constitution and sought legitimization in the people's eyes. On April 2nd, 1989, presidential and legislative elections were held. Mr. Ben Ali was the only presidential candidate, the only one.
A été seul candidat aux élections présidentielles. Seul. Il a été, entre guillemets, élu, parce qu'il a été décidé. Par combien?
He was elected, in quotes, because he had already been chosen. By how many? By 99.27%. Fortunately, 0.70% was able to preserve Tunisians' freedom of choice.
Pour les élections législatives, il y a eu des partis qui se sont présentés, des partis légaux, et comme le parti de la Ennahda.
As for the legislative elections, some legal parties ran. And since the Ennahda Party, which at the time was called the Islamic Tendency Movement, MTI, was not legal, it encouraged independent lists. These independents, encouraged by Ennahda, obtained a national average of 17%, despite the goings-on, despite the rigging. In Tunis and other constituencies, the independents won 30%. All the other legal parties put together did not obtain more than 4.5 or 5%.
Encouragés par la Ennahda, ont eu 30%. Les autres partis légaux, additionnés ensemble, n'ont pas dépassé 4,5–5%.
Bourguiba, who was removed from power because he was senile, was again brought into the spotlight on April 2nd, 1989, to support the president who toppled him on November 7th, 1987. Unfortunately, these elections were rigged, and Tunisians saw them as another instance of trickery. The parliament continues to be the domain of the only party in power for 36 years. Then the settling of accounts began with those who took part in the elections and those who supported them, that is, the Ennahda Party. Among the victims, Habib Marzouki. After such pressure, I was tried. They said it was for belonging to an unrecognized organization, but in fact, it was the liquidation of an adversary, of a whole trend. I spent several months in different prisons.
Je vais abréger un petit peu mon histoire politique parce que je n'en ai pas. Je vais la commencer, si vous voulez bien, à partir de 89. Parce que c'est là où j'ai commencé.
I will make short of my political history because I don't have one. I will start with 1989 because that is when I began to act in the political sphere, when I became involved to some extent. I participated in an independent role in the April '89 elections in the city of Monastir, Mr. Mzali's hometown. And it is for this reason that they are not content to take my wife and children as hostages, but rather use my 15-year-old daughter and 18-year-old son as political examples.
on leur a attenté actuellement à ma fille de 15 ans et à mon fils de 18 ans des procès politiques.
Ce contraste entre le discours théorique et l'exercice quotidien du pouvoir, c'est le code de la presse. Beaucoup de gens ont dit que Ben Ali a fait
Between
voter
theoretical discourse and the daily exercise of power is the press code. Many people said that Ben Ali passed a law favoring a progressive press code. They gained nothing. The repressive provisions are still in place in this code. The proof, Mr. Chairman, and you have the documents, is that all the opposition and even the independent free press is either seized or chooses to stop publishing. There are journalists in prison today, for example, Mr. Jabali, editor of El Fajr, and Mr. Omer Sahabou, editor of Le Maghreb magazine.
aujourd'hui en prison. Comme M. Jbeli, directeur du journal Fajr, et M. Omar Sahabou, directeur du journal Le Maghreb.
Today, only government-controlled newspapers are allowed to publish. They are profuse in their denunciations of Ennahda and write about its plotting, showing kitchen knives, tracts, and bottles of acid as evidence. Although a few months before the military trial began, they escalated their talk to Stinger missiles.
المؤامرة المزعومة اللي يتكلم بها بن علي هي مؤامرة الشعب عليه ما لعلاش ما هيش مؤامرته على الشعب شعب تونس كله له.
Is the imaginary plot Ben Ali talks about really a plot by the people? Why not his conspiracy against the people, who are being massacred? Against the sons of Tunisia, such as Sadak Shuru, an erudite man, a university professor whose hands were cut off. His only crime was not sharing Ben Ali's views. His position is not that of Ben Ali and the ruling party. And there is Dr. Moncef Ben Salem, who has published his scientific research in dozens of American, French, Italian, and other journals and magazines. They have been told for a long time that if, for their own ends, they want to crush Tunisia's identity and personality, and then Tunisia would be lost, feudal, they should be prepared to annihilate 8 million Tunisians.
وتقديره على شخصية تونس وتونس تونس ضايعة إقطاعية ليكم تهيئوا باش تقضيوا على 8 ملايين تونسي.
Ennahda denies these allegations and points to its participation in cultural, economic, and scientific activities such as the publication of several books and the fact that it signed the National Pact. At Ennahda's first press conference in 1981, its leader, Arghanouchi, announced that the party was willing to follow the people's wishes. It collaborated with the recognized parties, its students took part in improving university life, and in terms of foreign policy, it maintained good neighborly relations. Meanwhile, the party in power was preparing a secret plan of action against the Islamists.
هذه السياسة وقع التخطيط لها وإقرارها داخل أجهزة الحزب الحاكم.
This policy was devised and supported within the ruling party apparatus at the political bureau level as a secret plan which was disclosed and publicized by the press. The plan was the result of efforts by what is called the opportunistic left, which joined the ruling party, RCD, in groups. According to the plan, 1, it was necessary to use intelligently and carefully a method of disseminating propaganda and unsigned tracts. 2, collaboration with the Ministry of the Interior was required to exchange intelligence information and information about the integrationists' movements, where they were operating, and what their plans were. 3, collaboration with the structures of the Ministry of Culture and the Secretary of State for Religious Affairs was necessary in order to coordinate having a presence in mosques. 4, it was advisable for the structures mentioned to delegate a higher-ranking official to represent them in the central cell in order to plan at the party leadership level. In other words, all the state structures were used to confront what was called the obscurantist or extremist trend.
للتصدي لما سمي بالتيار الظلامي أو بالتيارات المتطرفة.
Monsieur Ben Ali, ministre de l'Intérieur, avait imaginé un complot islamiste.
Mr. Ben Ali, who was then the Minister of the Interior, had already imagined an Islamist plot, had arrested almost 6,000 Islamist and other activists, had organized the famous September 87 trial, and all this was to have Bourguiba see him as the savior of the regime.
Et tout cela pour que Bourguiba le considère comme le sauveur du régime.
Robinstein Carrera, a top lawyer from France, confirms a military trial concerning torture and fear tactics.
لم يتطور القضاء فيه شيء منذ ذلك الوقت وإنما زاد الأمر تدهورا.
Justice has not evolved since. On the contrary, things have become worse. It is true that the State Security Court was dissolved, but the military court has taken over its functions now. Today, thousands of people are brought before the military court despite the fact that they are not members of the armed forces.
آلاف من الناس محالون على المحكمة العسكرية رغم أنهم ليسوا عسكريين.
The 1990s will prove to be a decade of new alliances and alignments in which Islamic movements will challenge rather than necessarily threaten societies in the West. Contemporary Islam is more a challenge than a threat. It challenges the West to know and understand the diversity of the Muslim experience. It's a challenge to Muslim governments to be more responsive to popular demands for political liberalization and greater participation, to tolerate rather than repress opposition movements and build viable democratic institutions. At the same time, it challenges Western powers to stand by the democratic values that embody and recognize authentic populist movements and the right of people to determine the nature of their governments and leadership.
كيف نجسد إذن تفاصيل الحكم الإسلامي؟ هنا الأمر يرتد إلى العلماء.
How then is the authority of Islam carried out in practice? This is the ulemas' domain. The ulemas have jurisprudence, and the choice of jurisprudence to be applied is made by the majority of the people. Thus, the authority of God is limited through the mechanism of jurisprudence by which the people choose their law, their form of adherence to Islam, and to modernism. We want to embrace modernism in terms of absolute freedom of the spirit, in terms of knowledge, in terms of industry, in terms of democracy and power for the people. But we want to make our entry into modernism through our door, not through France's or America's or Russia's door. Do we not have the right to enter the modern world through our door? This is the crux of the disagreement between us and Europe.
وليس من باب فرنسا ولا من باب أمريكا ولا من باب روسيا. أليس لنا الحق في أن ندخل العالم الحديث من بابنا الخاص؟ هذا هو الخلاف بيننا إذن وبين الغرب.
الشعب التونسي كان يترقب في ذلك اليوم، يترقب ذلك اليوم حتى يعبر عن إرادته، حتى ينتخب من يمثله حقيقة. هذا من جانب. من جانب آخر.
On the one hand, the Tunisian people waited for the day to express their will and elect those who truly represent them. On the other, the contents of the November 7th communiqué were considered as very positive, full of aspirations. At the end of the election operation, however, after everything that happened during the campaign and on election day, it was clear that by the time April 2nd was over, November 7th was dead.
يعبر عن أن بانتهاء 2 أبريل بانتهاء كل شيء.
While November 7th breathed its dying breath, the families of martyrs said their last goodbyes to their children, killed in the latest clashes between the government and the people.